Welcome to this episode of Let's Be Civil. Today's guest on Let's Be Civil is Dr. Reid Castrodale. Dr. Castrodale is president of Castrodale Engineering Consultants, which is a firm providing services in the areas of bridge design, pre-stressed concrete, lightweight concrete, and the development of design and construction specifications. Reid was previously Director of Engineering with the Expanded Shale, Clay, and Slate Institute, as well as Director of Engineering with Carolina Stay-Lite Company. He's also managing technical editor for Aspire, the Concrete Bridge magazine. Okay, so welcome to the next installment of the podcast, Let's Be Civil. And today I've got a friend of mine, Reid Castrodale, with me. If he looks at me, he's going, man, all that gray hair. And if I'm looking at him, I'm going, man, all that gray hair, because there was a day when it was not that way.
That's right.
But it's that way today. So Reid's working from home like everybody else, but he always works at home. So this is really not much of a change for you. I mean, in what was it? You said 7 years ago you made the change to being on your own, and which has meant working from home. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why you made that change, and maybe too some of the kind of scary thoughts that went through your mind as you decided to now, because when you go on your own, you're responsible.
That's right.
So,
and I guess fortunately for me, it's just me. So I'm not having to be responsible for making sure everybody else is busy in the company too. Because that's just me. But that also means that I'm taking out the trash and doing all the accounting and ordering paper and trying to figure out why certain programs aren't working. Right. So, that's all up to me.
Right.
For years, I never imagined that I would ever go out on my own. I was sort of the last one on the face of the earth that I would ever expect would go out on my own. But I was working for an organization. Just to give a little bit of background, I worked for a consulting firm, then I went and got a master's and PhD down in sort of your neck of the woods, UT Austin. After that, went to North Carolina, worked for a bridge consultant for 6 years, and then went up to Portland Cement Association, where I was the bridge program manager of bridges, which interpreted for others would mean the bridge engineer for Portland Cement Association. So I was working nationally.
Right.
With bridge engineers. Then went back to work with a consultant, the same one, back down in North Carolina. Worked about 8 years for them, did a couple of sort of more researchy things. Then moved on to a lightweight aggregate supplier, believe it or not. I had some relationship with them over the years, and at any rate, I ended up promoting lightweight concrete for them, for bridges. As we got on with that, it came to the point where the company that I was working for had decided that they didn't want to keep sending me all over the country and do promotion for the rest of the institute, for the rest of the industry. They were pulling me back from that. Well, the rest of the industry was a little bit interested in still having me do that running around. So at that point, they came to me and said, Reid, why don't you go out on your own? And then we both can get some time with you. I also had a setup where I was the bridge consultant for the Georgia Carolinas PCI. So North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, I would meet with them regularly. The company at that point, the people I was working for, was getting a retainer of sorts. So at that point, if I went out on my own, I would have 3 different clients already set up. So they made me feel like that would probably be a pretty good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I really didn't want to do it particularly, I said, well, hey, it's presented itself to me.
Right, right.
Maybe this is it. You
Right.
know, let's give it the whirl, give it a
Right.
whirl.
Right, right. So how many different jobs have you had in your career? And let's consider this the last one.
This is probably the last one, yeah. And I have a fair amount of diversity in what I am doing now. I have a lot of different things, as I was mentioning to you a little earlier. I probably have too many things that are going on right now. That's one of the challenges of being a consultant.
Mm-hmm.
Either you are faced with not having enough to do, or you may be faced with having too much to do.
Right, right.
It'd be nice to find that sweet spot and always be there, but that's just not quite the way schedules and everything else works.
Right.
So I had worked as a consultant in 2 different organizations, but then one of the organizations I was there twice.
Right.
And
so you've held several positions over your career.
Right. So I was in production design. I was in promotion with both the lightweight folks and Portland Cement Association. But I was doing some research with when I was back at the consultant the last time. I did an NCHRP project. I was a PI on that, the principal investigator on a major bridge. It was more of a sort of an analysis and design kind of a thing. How can you extend the span ranges of pre-stressed concrete girders? So we looked at some options and figured out the one we needed to focus on was using post-tensioning to splice girders and make them longer. So worked up design examples and specification changes. And so I've been also involved not only in the design side, but been involved with developing specification changes. I was involved with the Pre-Stressed Concrete Institute, or the Precast Pre-Stressed Concrete Institute, PCI.
Right.
I was the co-chair of their Bridge Design Manual Steering Committee for like 20 years, from when we came up with the idea all the way through getting somebody to start writing it and then starting to write it and develop it. And, you know, so you don't really think of that as being design work.
Right.
But it's very important. You're providing a resource to the industry that they didn't have up to that point.
Right.
Putting out a lot of good information. So that's sort of where I got into being an editor as well. And now I'm one of the things that I do is I'm the managing technical editor of Aspire magazine. Aspire is the concrete bridge magazine. So I do editing as well as a little bit of writing now and then. And I do other things that I'm writing. I'm doing a lightweight concrete design primer for federal highways right now. So that was written from ground zero. Just write us a book.
Yeah. So when you graduated from college, you know, BS degree, and you went to your first job, did it ever cross your mind while you were, you know, first few years in that position that you would, when you look back on your career, would have all of these various things that you've done? Did that thought even ever cross your mind as a young engineer that you would do all these different things?
No, not really. And even when I went to Georgia Tech for undergrad, so I was right down there in downtown Atlanta, and I went out and I was taking pictures because I had a feeling like I was going to go to grad school and I might even be a professor someday.
Okay.
So there was that thought, but I wanted to go ahead and go out and work. So I worked for 2 years, and then I went back and did get my master's and PhD.
Right.
But then I didn't go into teaching.
Right. Well, let me ask you about that, because that's an interesting thing that I know this crossed my mind because for me, becoming a professor was always the goal. That's just who I knew I was and what I wanted to do. But I always wondered if I went, you know, once I got a PhD and I would go, if I were to go into industry, would it be difficult because people wouldn't know what to do with a PhD? as opposed to a new student with a BS. They know exactly what to do with them.
That's right.
So, as you had those advanced degrees, did you face any issues with people wondering?
I certainly did.
Okay.
Exactly the issues you said.
Okay.
I started interviewing as I was approaching the end, and I think I had 10 or 12 interviews and one offer. And many of them were, well, why do you want to work for us? You're overqualified.
Right.
And then the one company that did give me an offer, that is the owner of the company, said, we're going to hire this guy. Turns out that my dad was singing in a choir with a guy who was a really good friend of the owner.
So he made him hire you?
I don't know what, but he got some perspectives other than just what I presented.
Right.
And they had already had a PhD work for them, and they couldn't figure out what he could do for them. It didn't work out so well. So any rate, they brought me on.
Right.
And I did some designs. I did a number of things. I know that at one point I did a culvert that Duke Power was wanting to run a monster transformer over. And at some point the project manager said, well, I think you've spent as much time on designing that thing as it's going to cost to build it. So I probably over-designed it. So yes, there is some of that goes on.
Right.
And then after a while, I became the guy that, since I had a PhD, I probably could understand computers. So I became the internet guy, actually back then we were just getting into that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I ran the computer systems and customized AutoCAD and worked with the surveyors on developing how to get the data out of their little machines and into the computers. And I didn't have background in that, but I figured it out. So,
Right.
Yeah, so there was a bit of a challenge there. But then when I went away to Portland Cement Association, I was just doing the sort of more PhD kinds of things, support, training, teaching, developing courses, seminar kinds of things.
Sure.
And then I went back to the engineering firm, same one. And they said, don't ask him any IT questions. He's going to do other things now. So, I was reviewing and I was coming up with some of these research things that I did.
But I guess at that point they knew what to do with you then.
Yeah. It was a little better defined. So,
Right. Well, and I suspect too that as you went on with your career and the PhD was no longer new, that's who you were. People didn't get hung up on the PhD part.
Right.
I suspect that at the beginning they were hung up on the degree, but then your career established who you were. The degree wasn't an issue for anybody. And probably in some instances it mattered that they wanted you to have it.
Yeah. And
kind of have the associated education and experience that would go with it. So.
And I think it really makes a difference where you go and what you've learned for your PhD. I think for me, it was very helpful for me to go to UT Austin just because there was so much design-wise and testing-wise. I was out in their lab and you could see the steel bridge people testing their bridges, and you could help out with that. And then you were building and testing your concrete bridges and all that. So that I got a really good feel for behavior. And understanding of how you make a pre-stressed girder. That's what both my master's and PhD were about, pre-stressed girders, and I had to build them for both. And we built our own, so you understand what's going on. And, and you have glitches along the way. You learn about all kinds of things. So it all builds with time. So it's interesting how that works out.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the program at Texas State and its focus on technology applications to infrastructure. And then you had mentioned as a part of your role with the magazine that you became aware of this individual that has produced some, well, you can tell us about it, but the sort of the bridge inventory page.
Right.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's
Okay. Well, I'll go back to when I was at Portland Cement Association.
sure.
There was actually a fellow at Federal Highways back then that had gotten a master's degree, and he had looked at the National Bridge Inventory, NBI, data that was out there, and he started making some, doing an analysis, I guess, of that data, because it gives information about every bridge in the US, because by law, every one has to be inspected at least every 2 years. It's sort of a high level inspection, but it still gives you some data about each bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working for Portland Cement Association, so we were wanting to say, okay, what does it tell us about concrete bridges versus steel bridges?
Right, right.
So there was some work that was being done there. So we were getting that NBI data from the Federal Highways, and then we had to process it and do all kinds of work with it. And ever since, I've been collecting that data.
Mm.
You can go out on the internet right now and download it back to 93, I think it is, or maybe it's 83. I forget how long, far back it goes. So you could do an analysis if you had a big enough way to do that, which I didn't, and I wasn't a database programmer. Well, then I came to find out recently that Federal Highways has actually put all of that together into a portal called InfoBridge. And that portal makes available all of that NBI data for however long it's been available. And you can go look at a particular bridge. You can trace the condition rating of the deck, the superstructure, the substructure, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You can trace that with time, which then I guess would bump back up if they do a rehabilitation on it or something like that.
Right.
That could be improved, and it'd bump back up, because the bridge doesn't change unless you change the substructure elements. That defines the age of a bridge. So there are a number of interesting things that you can learn from the NBI, and this InfoBridge portal just makes it very useful.
Right.
For somebody like me, if you want something specific, a particular bridge, or if you want multiple bridges. It was interesting. This is just a gee whiz. Years ago, I was getting ready to go do a seminar in Hawaii. And at about the same time, I got a call from Alaska. And they wanted some information about maybe we could put a lightweight concrete deck, or a lightweight something or other deck, probably not even concrete, on the Yukon River Bridge. And I thought, well, I'll go look up the Yukon River Bridge. I wonder how many there are. So I put in, there's one bridge in Alaska over the Yukon River, and it runs from one corner of the state to another, and that's a big state. Yeah, there's only one bridge that crosses it. So I found that out in there. And it turns out that the Alaska and Hawaii have the same number, roughly the same number of bridges.
Well, I thought you were going to tell me they were going to ask you to come to their states at the same time, and you were going to have to decide were you going to Hawaii or were you going to go to Alaska for a week.
No, it was just a useful or a useless trivia fact that I got out of that exposure. So I was looking at the Hawaii because I was going there, and then I was looking at Alaska because I was trying to find the Yukon Bridge out of certainly many of them, and it turns out there was just the one.
Yep.
So yeah, it's an interesting resource. You can learn a lot of different things. It is limited in the information you can get, and one has to appreciate that in order to properly use that data.
Right.
So one has to be careful. Some people try to misuse it. They don't try to misuse it. They do misuse it because they don't understand it. One always has to consider and understand the source of your data and the intent of the data to make sure that you're going to use it properly and not present information from it that perhaps isn't valid.
Yeah. No, that's a really that's an excellent point. So tell me, I always like the sort of the bookend questions. You know, maybe people don't like to answer my bookend questions, but I like to ask them. So, what was the most interesting? And interesting can be challenging, could be fun. However you want to define interesting. What's the most interesting thing that you've done during your career? And so the bookend question is going to be, what was the most challenging for whatever reason that it was hard to figure out, or things kept changing, whatever it might be. But give us sort of the two ends of the spectrum for you. The thing, you know, what did you really like, and what was more of a struggle?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be in the same, you know, position or anything like that. Just over your
Sure.
career,
Yeah.
does anything pop into your head when someone says, what was the most interesting job, you know, particular task that you had?
Uh-huh. Well, there was one project that sort of stood out that was interesting. Was a bridge in downtown Charlotte that I was involved with the second time when I went back to the bridge consultant. It was between a hotel and the Charlotte Convention Center. And that's sort of weird. You know, you're going across a hotel parking deck, and then you're going across the street, and then you're going across the top of a convention center. Then you're actually going through some walkway in the convention center, and then out the other side you're on grade. But you were going over exhibit halls, and you ended up with floating slabs that had isolation devices so that the noise of the train wouldn't get down to the exhibit hall below. And it had all kinds of bizarre, you know, factors that were going on there, not to mention just the design of the bridge. I came up with a really nice design with some arch shapes and all this, but then they went and moved the support, so all that went away, and we just have girders. So that was disappointing. But so it was interesting. I got in on the very front end, so I was there with the proposal and the concept for the bridge, and then working through it for a number of years as we tried to get the thing put together and put some aesthetics on the railings. No, so we didn't have the curves on the bridge, and just a lot of different aspects that were challenging and unique and interesting. Stray current, there's things about when you have these electrified trains running over structures that those currents can get into the reinforcement and can cause corrosion and problems. So then you have to tie it all together and go ground it. And so there are a lot of different aspects that one does not normally encounter.
Right.
Another one was we were going through the roof and down and putting foundations inside the building. So you had to figure out a place. Where in the world can we put a foundation through a truck loading dock so that you're not obliterating functionality of the truck loading dock?
Right.
You know, and it turns out there were gold mines underneath that building, so there were actually spots where you couldn't build under that building.
Wow.
So it, like I say, it was a very interesting project. And one can go downtown and say, I designed that bridge.
Right. Yep.
That's one of the nice things that one gets with a bridge design activity, is now and then you can point to one that you said, I was involved with that one.
Well, I'll tell you, I still don't want to get off of the, you know, what kept you up at nights project, but it's always interesting to me because, and so I think there must be some kind of a personality trait for civil engineers. We like to be able to point to something and say, I did that. You know, that's something I hear a lot from people when I talk to them, you know, like we are now, is that whether it's a bridge or something else, that it's fulfilling, it's professionally satisfying to be able to say there's an example of what I do, because you don't understand what I do. There it is. Maybe that will help you. You know?
Right. Well, there were two bridges that I worked on that involved this spliced girder concept that I had developed. One I did actually prior to doing that work, and then one I did afterwards. And neither has been built because it was back in the day of design alternates, and they took the steel bridge instead of the concrete bridge. So I can point to that bridge isn't what I designed. But I designed something didn't use it.
Imagine that there's a concrete structure there, not that steel thing that's there. So that would be kind of funny.
And you learn one point there is you learn that there are aspects to some of these wonderful ideas that we have as designers that one doesn't anticipate that will define whether or not your great idea is going to work or not. In one case, it was a very narrow intracoastal waterway crossing where we wanted to put a concrete bridge across it, and there just wasn't room to put a big enough crane and keep the crossing open for the contractor to be able to set the big girders that were going to be coming from concrete. At least that's how I understood it. So, you know, that wasn't really a problem with our system. It was the site and some things like that. We also have come up with over the years, let's use precast decks for our bridges to speed up construction. But they don't seem to catch on. And then you come to find out that they have what's called a DBE requirement, the disadvantaged business requirement, that the state says so much of the work that a contractor has to do has to go to these disadvantaged whatever business entities or whatever that stands for. And come to find out that they use their deck pans, and the reinforcement in the deck is done by those people. So if you put in your wonderful idea of a precast deck panel, that just eliminated a lot of their, if not all of their satisfaction of this requirement, so they're not going to do it. Well, that has nothing to do with my great idea for a precast deck panel. But functionally and practically, it eliminates it from consideration.
Right.
So it's sometimes we have to understand that it's not just design stuff that's going to make what we do work or not work. We're working in a larger environment that has lots of players and lots of factors that are involved. Just interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's another excellent point, because if you know, we have in some of the classes planned, but, you know, and I'm thinking back to classes that I've taught in the past, where you ask the students to make comparisons between a couple alternatives, and how do you actually go about deciding which one of the alternatives is what's going to be built? And those socioeconomic, non-engineering things can be what tips the scale to one over the other, and it has nothing to do with the engineering quality. I guess we assume that the engineering is there and it's correct, and it can be something else. It can be, you know, like the one you mentioned, construction. Can you actually build this thing? Can play a key role. Where and we're getting close to the end of our time, but where do you see bridges going? Is FRP, is the fiber, you know, basically fiberglass for, you know, in sort of the street lingo? Do you see fiberglass bridges becoming more of the norm? Excuse me, or is there something else? What do you think's coming that will be different about bridges?
That's a good question. Excuse me.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah, 'tis the season for pollen. We're seeing a lot of different things, like you mentioned the FRP, but then there are those that, well, I'll back up just a little bit. We're dealing with structures that are exposed to sometimes unknown issues, extreme events.
Right.
So bridge owners, especially DOTs, but if you ever do something for the railroad, it's extreme when you get to the railroad. They want structures that will take anything or be able to be repaired as quickly as possible, because for the railroad, oftentimes you have no detour, and if you're shut down, there's no revenue. So you've got to get that thing open. So they work very quickly. So they'll design a bridge to have 4 girders, and they build it with 6. They're all the same girders. So that means if one gets damaged, they still have all the capacity that they need.
Right.
So there are ways that people think. So durability, redundancy, excess capacity can really enter into something like a bridge, where lots of times we think, let's sharpen my pencil and get down to as little material as I can. And that may or may not be the answer.
Right,
Always.
right.
So there are some limitations to something like a composite bridge, FRP. Another issue is that it's not all about strength. It's also about deflections.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an FRP structure, it's going to be much more flexible. So it will tend to bounce. You know, you'll have vibrations, which are, and we don't have a real good way to quantify that right now. We need one. But it may be that they're going to be too bouncy. So you don't want that. It'll end up tearing up things or not working as well, or just be disagreeable if you were walking across that bridge and you're going up and down. One can do that on a steel bridge too, or a concrete bridge for that matter. We are seeing UHPC, ultra high performance concrete, that's moving concrete in a direction we've not seen before, where we're minimizing section dimensions. We're getting closer to like a steel cross section instead of what we've normally had. And there seems to be some great promise there. It has been something that's been a proprietary material, but now they're developing ways that people are doing it with their own local materials. The PCI again is actually doing some research and pushing that. Federal Highways is doing some work on it. I expect we'll have a design specification fairly shortly. And one of the challenges is to get a 300-foot girder that's in one piece, that's concrete. Wow. Now the problem is there are very few places you can build one of those and get it out of the plant and get it to anywhere where it's needed. Unless you're on the water. So it might be a great idea, but it may not be very practical for most applications, but it may in some. And one of the benefits of UHPC, it's highly resistant to chemical attack, to corrosion. So for coastal situations,
it's a good option.
Even for piling. They're looking at making H piles, and they can drive them with as big a hammer as you want, as hard as you want to drive it, and it won't mess the pile up. Without they call it a cushion on the top of a pile. They'll drive it without a cushion, and it still works great. And you just can't do that to any other material. So there are some things like that that are coming on that may actually be transformative, at least in a few in some selected areas. It may not totally replace what we have right now, but it's interesting.
Well, it sounds like we need to get together again to talk of the technical side of the bridge things. And so this has been really fascinating. It's always to me interesting to talk with people that have had multiple, if you want to call them careers, multiple jobs of a decent duration, you know, that you were in the company or the organization for long enough to really, you know, like I look at a year as a vacation. So you weren't on vacation with somebody. You lived there, you know, for a while. So it gives you a new perspective on things because, you know, you may be living in a different part of the country, and who your employer is has a different perspective on what employment means, you know, and so that part's interesting to me. And then we'll have to. I'll add you to my list of follow-up calls, follow-up conversations where we can talk. Maybe pull out a bridge or two and talk about the engineering details of them.
Sure.
So, okay. Well, I appreciate you joining me for Let's Be Civil. Add you to the growing list of people on the podcast, and I hope everybody watching gets something out of our conversation. So, Reid, good seeing you again, and have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep. All right. Take it easy.
Okay. You too.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.